substances and accidents, 3 parts to the human soul, 4 types of causes, 4 kinds of elementary matter, which everything on earth is made of, rotating crystalline spheres that carry the heavenly bodies along on their perfectly circular orbits around earth. These are all ideas of ancient Greek thinkers, most notably Aristotle and Ptolemy, ideas that medieval Western scholars believed were absolutely and forever true, explained everything, ideas that, with the blessing of the Church, dominated their philosophy and science for centuries, science that was, as we would say today, settled. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, culture, classical learning, literacy, trade, and prosperity, all of these drastically declined in the West. Around the beginning of the 1400s, a period that later historians came to call the Renaissance, this elaborate structure began to develop cracks and eventually collapsed after a long-lost poem was rediscovered, a poem that taught a very different ancient Greek philosophy, Epicureanism, and that eventually set in motion a scientific revolution that helped create the modern West, a society where the universe no longer revolves around mankind and nothing is certain. Really? A poem? How could a poem start a scientific revolution? That sounds crazy. How is that even possible? Let's find out. Welcome to Depth History, where we talk about how the human condition created and creates the human condition. Epicureanism emerged in Athens around 300 BCE, when the philosopher Epicurus gathered in his garden a community of men and women who sought tranquility, freedom from anxiety in their daily lives. His teachings, which were all in conflict with traditional religious beliefs, were: all religion is false, cruel, dangerous illusions that needlessly torment people. The universe has always existed. There was no creator or designer. If there are gods, they're not interested in humans. They don't punish or reward us, and they pay no attention to our prayers. Death is final. There's no afterlife, but there's no reason to be afraid of it, because the soul dies with the body and feels nothing after death. The highest goal of human life is pleasure and the avoidance of pain, both physical and mental, to live a happy life without worries or anxiety. All matter consists of infinitely many, unimaginably small, uncreated atoms that have always existed, in constant motion in the infinite void of space, randomly colliding with each other, sometimes sticking to each other and thus forming everything in the universe, so that everything that happens by chance. There is no divine providence overseeing and directing this. There is no divine plan. Epicureanism is a thoroughly atheistic philosophy. All its beliefs are incompatible with traditional religions. The early church fathers strongly condemned Epicureanism for its atheism, its emphasis on pleasure as the highest good, which in their view encouraged an immoral and lascivious life, and its atomism. Clement of Alexandria called Epicurus the leader of atheism and condemned him for abolishing providence, deifying pleasure, and failing to apprehend God. Bishop Gregory Thaumaturgus wrote that Epicureans were guilty of abandoning the common opinion of mankind, saying that there is neither God nor providence. Bishop Eusebius said that Epicurus' atomic theory was equivalent to the denial of providence, God, an immortal soul, a rational being, and a logos of God. Not just Christians. The 3rd century CE Jewish Mishnah declared that all Israel has a share in the world to come, except for Epicureans. Yet, church fathers did sometimes find something positive to say about Epicureans. The same Clement of Alexandria who labeled Epicurus the leader of atheism also wrote that the co-education that prevailed in the school of Epicurus, unique as it was for the time, was a notable illustration with which to demonstrate that women are the equal of men, and under the influence of the Christian gospel, surely is capable of attaining to the perfection that was the goal of all true knowledge. St. Ambrose wrote that according to Epicurus, neither drinking, nor revels, nor offspring, nor relations with women, nor abundance of fish and other things make life sweet, but only sober reasoning. Since the Church taught that Christians should concern themselves not with this life, but with preparing for the next life, Christian life couldn't be calm. Christians were supposed to be in constant anxiety about the ultimate fate of their souls, heaven or hell. After the fall of the Roman Empire and the spread of Christianity, European books pretty much stopped being copied and began to slowly disappear. But Epicureans themselves did not quite disappear. The 14th century Tuscan poet Dante Alighieri wrote, "In this part of hell we shall find the burial place of Epicurus and all his followers, for whom the soul dies when the body dies." The 15th century Tuscan Giovanni Boccaccio wrote, "And since Guido tended to subscribe to the opinions of the Epicureans, it was said among the common herd that these speculations of his were exclusively concerned with whether it could be shown that God did not exist." The fact that both Dante and Boccaccio knew that Guido, a real person, had been an Epicurean indicates that unbelief was not exactly unknown in Renaissance Florence. Among the heresies that Cristoforo Landino listed as alive in 1481 was the belief that our bodies won't rise again, and the heretical views of the Medici poet Luigi Pulci, who was deprived of a Christian burial for decrying miracles and describing the soul as no more than a pine nut in hot white bread. We're also told that the Chancellor Carlo Marsupini, who taught Greek oratory and philosophy in the university, died in 1453 without confessing on communion and not as a good Christian. The classical period, its texts, and the pagan ideas they expressed were an unavoidable presence in Western Christendom, but the Church couldn't ban them because most of the texts used to teach Latin, the language of the Church, had been written by pagan Roman authors. Around the start of the 1400s, a movement began to gain strength among the few educated men whom historians called Renaissance humanists, at first mostly in Italy, men who were obsessed with books that had been written more than 1,500 years before their time, in languages that were no longer even spoken in Western Europe. Knowing that so many pagan books had been lost over the centuries, the humanists searched cathedral and monastery libraries for copies that might have survived. Cosimo de' Medici, the effective ruler of Florence, persuaded a monk, Ambrose Taraseveri, to translate from the Greek a pagan work that had recently arrived from Constantinople, Diogenes Laertes' 3rd century CE Lives and Opinions of Eminent Philosophers. In a letter written in 1433, when he had finished the translation, Traverseri complained of the inappropriateness of the job for a monk. Only 2 considerations, he said, could justify it. First, that a greater knowledge of the opinions of pagan philosophers made clearer their hopeless discord and drove the reader more firmly to the one clear truth of Christianity. And second, that their biographies included some inspiring examples of almost Christian behavior. Lives includes biographies of 81 Greek and Roman philosophers and summarizes their teachings. The last and longest chapter is devoted to Epicurus, who already in his lifetime was a controversial figure. For they say that he, Epicurus, spent time with the courtesan Leontion, that he presented as his own the doctrines of Democritus about atoms, and those of Aristippus about pleasure, Epictetus calls Epicurus a writer of obscenities and utterly reviles him. Timocrates says that Epicurus vomited twice a day from overindulgence, and that Epicurus was unacquainted with reasoning and knew even less of life, that his body was in a sorry state, since for many years he had been unable to rise from his litter. Epicurus's moral status was important because it was believed at the time that only virtuous authors could produce virtuous books, books that good Christians were permitted to read. A sinful author was incapable of producing a virtuous book, so rejecting Epicurus on moral grounds amounted to rejecting Epicureanism. But, Diogenes adds, but these people are out of their minds, for there are a great many witnesses who attest to the man's matchless courtesy toward everyone, his native land honoring him with bronze statues, his friends so numerous they could not be measured by entire cities, and all who knew him, captivated as they were by the siren spells of his doctrine. The school itself, which at the time when all others have nearly died out, lives on forever. As for Epicurus's alleged degenerate lifestyle, he himself says in his letters that he managed on a diet of plain bread and water. Elsewhere he says, "Send me a small pot of cheese so that I may feast luxuriously whenever I like." Such was the man who asserted that pleasure is the goal of life. In 1417, when the Church's Council of Constance was trying to resolve the Western Schism, a time when there were 3 rival popes, Poggio Bracciolini, a Florentine humanist and a newly unemployed papal secretary, went rummaging through monastery libraries and discovered what was, at the time, believed to be the only surviving copy of 1st century BCE Roman poet Lucretius's long didactic poem De Rerum Natura, on the nature of the universe. The poem consists of about 7,400 lines and is divided into 6 books. In Book 1, Lucretius says that gods, though they may exist, take no interest in the affairs of humans and pay no attention to their prayers. He declares that the universe consists of nothing but atoms and void, and he condemns superstitious religion, invoking as proof the cruel sacrifice by the Greek king Agamemnon of his daughter Iphigenia. More often, on the contrary, it is religion breeds wickedness, and that has given rise to wrongful deeds. As when the leaders of the Greeks, those peerless peers, defiled the Virgin's altar with the blood of Agamemnon's child Iphigenia, with solemn ceremony to the accompanying strain of loud-sung bridal hymns, but as a maiden pure of stain, to be impurely slaughtered at the age when she should be wed. Book 2 begins with an image of someone standing on a cliff, watching a ship being battered by a storm, knowing that he himself is in no danger, his mind free of anxiety and fear, enjoying a feeling of contentment. A joy it is, when the strong winds of storm stir up the waters of a mighty sea, to watch from shore the troubles of another. No pleasure this in any man's distress, but joy to see the ills from which you are spared. This is followed by a detailed description of atoms and their movements, the swerve, and how compound bodies are formed. Book 3 explains that the soul also consists of atoms, and so, when the body dies, the soul also dies. There is no need to fear death. Therefore, we may be certain that in death there is nothing to fear, that he who does not exist cannot feel pain. Book 4 discusses the human senses, dreams, and sex. Lucretius recommends that in order to achieve tranquility, a man should avoid falling in love. For desire makes men blind, and generally they overlook their girlfriends' faults and bless these women with fine qualities they don't in fact possess. Book 5 describes the world's origins and the dawn of civilization, all of this happening without divine guidance or intervention. But even if I had no knowledge of atoms, this from the order of the heavens itself, and many other facts, I would assert that in no way for us the power of gods fashioned the world and brought it into being, so great the fault with which it stands endowed. Book 6 discusses nature, thunderstorms, lightning, earthquakes, magnets, and diseases, denying that meteorological and earthly phenomena are divine manifestations. This miasma is what caused the fatal tide of pestilence years back in Athens that blighted fields and left no trace of traffic on the roads and made a ghost town of the place. From deep in the heart of Egypt it uprose and crossed the vast expanse of air and swimming plains until it fell at last wholesale upon the people of Athens. Wave after wave, in legions, they were handed over to sickness and the grave. Renaissance humanists carefully studied both these books, but especially on the nature of the universe, which, despite its very unchristian message, was widely read and discussed by devout Christians all over Europe. It wasn't only the shocking religious content of these two books, atheism and materialism, that explains their appeal, but also the timing, the environment into which they were introduced. The animated milieu of Renaissance humanists, an intellectual atmosphere of fierce pro- and anti-scholastic disputes, a philosophical and religious worldview threatened by the discovery of new continents and new pagan peoples who seemed to be doing quite well without the benefit of religion, new trade routes and wealth and the opportunities they brought, and later the Protestant Reformation, the shattering of the religious unity of Western Christendom. Lucretius's religious content reappeared at a moment when religious orthodoxy felt itself to be under an acute and new set of threats. The sudden presence of Stoics, Cynics, Skeptics, Platonists, Aristotelians, Neoplatonists, and Epicureans, all providing radically different rival solutions to the fundamentals of metaphysics. It generated a dizzying moment in the history of heterodoxy. Just as humanists were digesting and distributing these rival systems, the advent of Protestantism produced dozens more. Within a half a century of their arrival, both books had been copied, recopied, and then printed. More than 50 manuscripts of each book survive in Florence alone, including one by the infamous political philosopher Niccolò Machiavelli. The poem was read and discussed privately by readers who justified their interest because of the poem's literary excellence. It was so beautifully written that it could serve as a model for their own writing. And as everyone knew, it was crucially important for educated Christians to be able to write Latin well. The publisher of a 1563 edition justified studying the atheistic and materialistic poem by referring all its insane and frenzied ideas and absurdities back to Epicurus, the divine poet. Epicurus was not himself to be blamed for merely reporting them. Even though the poem itself is alien to our religion because of its beliefs, it is no less a poem. Merely a poem? Rather, it is an elegant poem, a magnificent poem, a poem highlighted, recognized, and praised by all wise men. What are these insane and frenzied ideas of Epicurus, those absurdities about a fortuitous conjunction of atoms, about innumerable worlds, and so on? Good Christians needn't worry about studying the poem, since neither is it difficult for us to refute them, nor indeed is it necessary, certainly when they are most easily disproved by the voice of truth itself, or by everyone remaining silent about them. As long as the poem was available only in Latin, church censors could pretend to accept at face value its readers' claims that they admired its poetic qualities, but of course completely rejected its philosophy. This attitude changed when translations began to appear and ordinary people began to read the poem, though strangely it was never put on the church's index of forbidden books. The first translated editions were French in 1650, English in 1682, and Dutch in 1701. An Italian translation was completed in 1688, but the Church denied permission to print it until 1717. We said earlier that the Epicureanism on the nature of the universe had set in motion the scientific revolution that helped create the modern West, and now we'll discuss that claim in more detail. Aristotelian philosophy and Ptolemaic astronomy had been adopted by the Church for two reasons. The 13th century St. Thomas Aquinas had, so to speak, converted Aristotle to Christianity by showing how the Aristotelian physics of substance and accident explained the Eucharist, in which the wafer and wine were miraculously changed into the body and the blood of Christ, though their outward appearance remained the same. The Ptolemaic picture of a universe with the earth at its center reinforced the idea that the universe had been created for the sake of the most important and precious of God's creatures, man. Because the science was settled, there was no reason to inquire more deeply into these topics. What was the benefit of uncovering any of nature's inner workings, especially since no research was even possible, because the true essences of substances and their accidents were permanently hidden from human senses? Medieval culture valued and respected authority, especially the authority of the ancients, but it didn't value questioning authority. But there was another problem. Curiosity about the natural world was severely frowned upon by the Church, which identified it with the worst of the 7 deadly sins, the sin of pride. From the patristic period to the beginning of the 17th century, curiosity was regarded as an intellectual vice. Curious individuals were considered to be proud and puffed up, and the objects of their investigation were deemed illicit, dispute-engendering, unknowable, or useless. 17th century projects for the advancement of learning had to distance themselves from curiosity and its dubious fruits, or, alternatively, enhance the moral status of the curious sensibility. Curiosity, along with pride and disobedience, had been the reason for the first sin, eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge, and the subsequent fall of the entire human race. The Bible warned against its dangers. Seek not out things that are too hard for thee, neither search the things that are above thy strength. Be not curious in unnecessary matters. St. Paul had said, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, the intelligence of the intelligent I will frustrate. And whatever does not proceed from faith is sin. During the so-called Dark Ages, there had certainly been many technological advances. The astrolabe, the compass, eyeglasses, gunpowder and paper imported from China, and Hindu-Arabic numerals from Muslims. But technological advances are not the same as scientific advances. Even though sailors were using compasses and people were using eyeglasses to help them read, no one really understood how they worked. Why does the compass needle point north? How do eyeglasses help people see better? These are exactly the kind of questions, exactly the curiosity that the Church warned against, and to which, on the nature of the universe, attempted to point the way to answers. The fear of secular knowledge began to erode as the authority of the Aristotelian and Ptolemaic systems were eroded. In 1543, the Polish astronomer Nicolaus Copernicus published the heliocentric theory that the Earth and the planets revolved around the Sun, rejecting the Earth-centered Ptolemaic astronomy which had held sway for more than 1,000 years. In his 1603 book of the Interpretation of Nature, the English philosopher and statesman Sir Francis Bacon claimed that scientific research would bring great benefits to humanity, that whoever succeeds in kindling a light in nature would be the benefactor indeed of the human race. In 1605, the Italian scientist Galileo Galilei disproved the Aristotelian theory of the immutability of the heavens when he showed that the supernovae of 1572 and 1604 were not sublunar phenomena, but distant stars. In 1609, he discovered, with a telescope he'd built himself, 4 of Jupiter's moons, effectively disproving Ptolemaic astronomy. Galileo also introduced observation, experiment, mathematical reasoning, and precise, verifiable laws of nature as decisive criteria of scientific investigation. In 1609, Johannes Kepler published his laws of planetary motion, replacing the circular orbits of Ptolemy with elliptical orbits, improving the accuracy of the Copernican model and establishing celestial mechanics on precise mathematical relationships. In his 1620 book, The Great Instauration, Bacon popularized inductive methodologies for scientific inquiry that would infer natural laws from particular instances observed under controlled conditions, a forerunner of the modern scientific method. In his posthumously published utopian novel, The New Atlantis, Bacon described a remote island society with a state-sponsored scientific research institution, Solomon's House, which is the very eye of this kingdom, where experiments are conducted to understand and conquer nature, and to apply the collected knowledge to the betterment of society. As new 17th century speculative treatises on sciences began to circulate, Lucretius was, so to speak, waiting in the wings, already available in nearly every scientist's library. They had read the poem and were familiar with his atomism and materialism. Lucretius was the most widely available source on non-divine science. So also in things, there is a smallest point beneath our sight, and this contains no parts, being of a stuff so slight it is the smallest stuff of all, and it can never start to exist as something separate, because it's always part of something else, primal and indivisible. That way, matter is composed from such parts in tight array, and since they can't exist alone, then they must closely cling to the atom and cannot be torn away by anything. Of all the Epicurean teachings, it was atoms that appealed most to scientists, although they often called them corpuscles or particles to pretend that it was somehow different from Epicurean atoms. Atomism could account for the huge variety of materials, metals, liquids, gases, the various forms of living things, in the same way that infinitely many words could be constructed from just a few letters of the alphabet. Atomism, unlike the Aristotelian concepts of substance and accidents, offered testable criteria for research. Atomism also explained why, despite centuries of trying to transform the base metals, lead, iron, and so on, into gold, alchemists hadn't had the slightest success. Gold and the base metals weren't composed of the same four Aristotelian elements as everything else, but fundamentally different atoms that couldn't be transformed into each other. But why were so many scientists prepared to accept atomism, since no proof was then available, especially since it conflicted with their religious beliefs, and in some cases with a powerful religious establishment? Scientists were able to do this if they were careful to downplay or avoid the conflict in one of four ways: adopting a measure of self-censorship, a dissimulatory code, to head off the threatening censorship of the church. Believe what you like, but don't talk about it in public. There was also the so-called theory of double truth, which recognized the authority of the church in the domain of theology, but at the same time preserved the independence of reason. So a statement could be false under theology, but true under reason. Accepting only parts of the theory while rejecting the offending parts. The French scientist and priest Pierre Gassendi defended the atomic theory, but insisted that atoms had been created by God and that their movements were not random but under God's control. Writing a dialogue where the unacceptable ideas are put into the mouth of a character other than the author, who can, by the end of the dialogue, reject those unacceptable ideas. As for the fact that there was as yet no proof for atomism, the same had been true for Copernicus's heliocentric theory, which also gained wide acceptance also in the face of opposition from the church, also before there was any solid proof for it. For many scientists, it was enough that the new theory was simpler and more elegant than the previous theory, and that it was amenable to experimentation. Proof could come later. Sir Isaac Newton, in his 1718 edition of his Optics, wrote, "All these things being considered, it seems probable to me that God, in the beginning, formed matter in solid, massy, hard, impenetrable, movable particles of such sizes and figures, and with such other properties, and in such proportion to space, as most conduced to the end for which he formed them, and that these primitive particles, being solids, are incomparably harder than any porous particles compounded of them, even so hard as never to wear or break into pieces, no ordinary power being able to divide what God himself made one in the first creation." Note how Newton avoided using the word atoms and twice emphasized that the particles had been created by God. In 1784, the chemist Henry Cavendish announced to the Royal Society his discovery that water was a compound of two elemental gases, hydrogen and oxygen. At room temperature, hydrogen and oxygen are gases, but when they're combined, they become water, a liquid at room temperature. It's difficult to see how this result could be fitted into the Aristotelian model. In 1808, the chemist John Dalton asserted that observations have tacitly led to the conclusion, which seems universally adopted, that all bodies of sensible magnitude, whether liquid or solid, are constituted of a vast number of extremely small particles, or atoms of matter, bound together by a force of attraction. Still, because nobody could see individual atoms, even under a microscope, it was a long time before atomic theory was universally accepted. The late 19th century physicist Ernst Mach, of whom Einstein said, "It is justified to consider Mach as the precursor of the general theory of relativity," denied that atoms were real, and his disciple Pierre Duhem announced in 1913 that the atomic theory was without a future. In fact, the atomic theory finally gained universal acceptance only with the discovery of the constituents of the atom, electrons, protons, neutrons, etc., in the mid-20th century. What had set all this in motion was the atomic theory of Epicurus. The Enlightenment located its utopia in the future, the Renaissance in the past, but aiming for either required the demolition of the present. Lucretius offered the mental tools for such demolition. Equally valuable, he offered provisional belief, which lets us live comfortably in a world in which truth is constantly demolished and replaced. If you're interested in learning more about this subject, I've included a list of books to read in the description below. Please join me in the next episodes, where we'll be discussing in detail individual areas like the abolition of slavery, the rise of religious skepticism and disbelief, human rights, women, and more. By the way, if you enjoyed this video, please click the like icon, share the video, subscribe, and ring the bell so that you'll be notified of new videos as soon as they come out. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.